thanks everybody for being here. Lovely to see so many people. That's great for this occasion. I'm very, very proud, very happy, very honored to introduce Professor Mercedes García-Arenal, tonight's keynote speaker. Mercedes is a research professor at the Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas, the CSIC in Madrid, and she's the world's leading expert on Muslim minorities on the Iberian Peninsula. She's been, since 2019, since we started our project, the leading PI, the coordinator PI of our Synergy grant, the European Qur'an, about which you heard quite a bit before. But before that, she has also been a principal investigator in another ERC, European Research Council grant, an advanced grant on the topic conversion, overlapping religiosities, polemics, interaction, early modern Iberia and beyond. That was a project that went on between 2013 and 2019. Throughout her distinguished career, Mercedes has studied the Muslim inhabitants of Europe in the late medieval and early modern period, the Spanish Inquisition, and Iberian North African history, opening new areas of inquiry in historical analysis and the study of religious minorities. A major area of focus of her scholarship has been the study of Moriscos, the people whom the Spanish crown forced to convert from Islam to Christianity after the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, and their descendants. Mercedes' work on the history of Iberia and North Africa has transformed and has been transformational, examining how the flows of people and ideas changed both Islam and Christianity in the West. But she also set new standards in the study of religious conversion. Often based on Inquisition documentation, her research on religious conversion is driven by original methodological approaches that center on the study of singular individual experiences of religious disengagement and the notions of religion and belonging that are used in these processes of conversion. Mercedes has received numerous awards, among them the Spain's highest honor for academic research, the Premio Nacional de Investigación Ramón Menéndez Pidal. And just now, she's been, I'm very happy to say, she's been awarded an honorary degree of a Doctor of Human Letters from the University of Chicago. She has written almost 40 authored and co-authored books and hundreds of articles, and I only want to mention a couple of them. The wonderful book she wrote a few years ago with Fernando Rodriguez Mediano, The Orient in Spain, Converted Muslims, the Forged Lead Books of Granada and the Rise of Orientalism. This book appeared in Spanish in 2010 and then in English 3 years later. And already in 1999 appeared the Spanish original of Samuel Palaci's biography, which she wrote together with her colleague Gerard Wiechers. It had the English title, A Man of Three Worlds. 3 worlds. Samuel Palaci, a Moroccan Jew between Catholic and Protestant Europe. The book has been translated from Spanish into English, Arabic, Italian, Dutch, and now recently also into Hebrew. And her most recent single-author book appeared just a few months ago. It has the title, The Inquisition Trial of Jerónimo de Rojas, Morisco from Toledo, and it appeared with Brill, I think, at the end of last year. Tonight, Mercedes will talk to us, on the Quran in early modern Iberia. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for New York University in Abu Dhabi for hosting us. And thank you most especially to Jan Loop for this very generous presentation, who has still put me more nervous because I am not sure I'm going to live up to your expectations, especially after this long but very wonderful day we've had with such a level of papers. I am going to talk to you about the Quran in Iberia, and what I am going to present is a part of the introduction of a book we have recently presented to the Greuter as a part of our project. It's called The Iberian Quran from the Middle Ages to the Modern Times. And as I say, I'll extracting this talk from the introduction I wrote for that book. Due to the long presence of Muslims in Iberia, both as inhabitants of the Islamic territories and as Muslim minorities in the Christian kingdoms, the Iberian Peninsula provides fertile soil for the study of the cultural history of the Quran in Europe, the focus precisely of the European Quran project to which we all belong. From the mid-12th century until at least the end of the 17th century, the efforts undertaken in Iberia by Muslims, religious scholars, and copyists on the one hand, and by Christian scholars and converts to Christianity on the other to copy, transmit, interpret, translate the Quran are of the utmost importance for the understanding and significance of the Quran in Europe. As a result of the long process generally known as the Reconquest, the northern Spanish Christian kingdoms, slowly expanding their frontiers southwards throughout the Middle Ages, came to contain large minorities of Muslims, the so-called mudehars, who were allowed under certain conditions to preserve and practice their faith. It was the first time in history that significant numbers of Muslims came to live under non-Muslim rule. Muslims in the Christian kingdoms, named mudehars before their conversion, and moriscos, converted Muslims, interpreted and translated their sacred scripture for their own use as they were becoming increasingly at home in the Romance vernacular and losing the knowledge of Arabic. There were translations from Arabic to vernacular Castilian or Aragonese, written in the Latin alphabet, or more frequently in what is called aljamiado, Romance vernacular in Arabic script. Here you have an interlinear Arabic and aljamiado text. The first written evidence we have of this kind of aljamiado, Arabic aljamiado, appears in Aragon in 1415. Here you have, this is not a Quran, but it is a famous book written, it's a tafsira, written by the Mancebo de Arévalo. I've put just a little cross if you want to try and read it in Spanish. Dice al-Ghazali, Serafin, Cabe. So it was something very usual, which was used for Quran, but also for other religious literature. A decade after the rendition of the capital city of Granada, the Nasrid kingdom, the last Muslim entity in the peninsula, the so-called Catholic monarchs, Fernando and Isabel, decreed in 1502 the expulsion to be avoided only by conversion of the entire Muslim population of the territories belonging to the Crown of Castile. In the Crown of Aragon, the Muslim population was allowed to practice Islam officially until 1526, when they were also forced to convert to Christianity. So there was a longer, let's say, period of official Islam and also of collaboration between Muslim scholars and Christian clerics or evangelizers. In Castile, the period was shorter, but we have very famous and important examples, such as the Quran translation made by Juan de Segovia in 1456 with the cooperation of the Faqih and Mufti Isa ibn Jabir from Segovia. This translation, which was trilingual, has not been conserved. We only have the prologue and the epistles that Juan de Segovia wrote to different colleagues explaining the methodology of the translation. But Isa de Gebir wrote a breviario Sunni, so a compendium of Muslim law, also in Al-Hamiyya, which you have here. So forced conversion of Muslims to Christianity was completed in the 1520s. Those who wanted to remain Muslim had to practice their religion in clandestinity. And from the 1530s onwards, under persecution by the Inquisition. The Inquisition had been founded before, but had dedicated its first decades to the persecution of converts from Judaism, and most especially to Protestants, reformados. But in the 30s, it starts very heavily to persecute Moriscos for practicing Islam in a clandestine way. By the end of the 16th century, Arabic was still spoken and written in parts of Spain. And Inquisition files contain highly detailed information of the use of Arabic until the expulsion, the general expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609-1614. And this was going to remain the fact, although there is a very important decree by the king, the Emperor Philip II, in 1567, prohibiting the written and oral use of the Arabic language, a decree that was the straw that provoked a war in Granada called the Rebellion of the Alpujarras, the War of the Alpujarras, a 2-year war that meant that the Kingdom of Granada had also to be, almost to be conquered anew, and provoked the deportation of the Granadans to northern Castile to make the situation more complex. This is the background of a long-term historical situation which makes Iberia a unique case study for the history of the translation of the Quran. On the one hand, no other area of Western Europe knew such an intense and enduring confrontation with Islam, and on the other, no other area had such a close and productive entanglement with Islam and Muslims, to the point that arguments over Spain's Islamic past have been a fundamental element in constructing its national identity, even until nowadays. The religious confrontation produced polemics and disputations, of which Quranic translations were an important part. But the term polemics that I just used covers a complex field of intellectual and religious activity in which the aims of knowing and confuting Islamic doctrines was intertwined, and not only directed to Muslims, but also to Christians, with the aim of separating clearly what was Christian and what was not. Translation of the Quran for Christian was a tool for converting the Muslims. For Muslims, translating the Quran was a protection from being converted, from getting lost or losing oneself in a Christian majority. The different strategies for converting and missionizing are also in Iberia, in the century I'm going to talk to you about, are also indicative of different ideological trends toward the use of sacred texts, and not only the Quran, inside Catholicism, or more precisely, Spanish Catholicism. I'll come back to this point because it's one of the points that interest me more in my own research. This is, as I have said, a long process that goes from the 12th century with the first translations of the Quran into Latin until colonial times. But in this talk, I will focus in the 16th century within a context where Arabic books and Arabic speakers who were familiar with the Quran and its exegesis coexisted with Christian populations, often sharing the same spaces with Christian scholars also, and with the centers of power, political and religious power. In Christian Iberia, the close proximity of Islamic tradition and sources and the availability of informants, most of them, but not all of them, converts, offered Christians interested in the Quran a privileged access to Islam. This is visible in a concept of Islam, even in anti-Islamic texts, that is much closer to the lived experience of the Muslims. A concept of Islam not limited to the Quran, but also more aware of the religious significance of tafsir and hadith than in other parts of Europe. The collaboration and contact between the two religions also produce reactions of separation and rejection on both sides. I will be referring to it later. As I have said, both communities were engaged in drawing clear boundaries between them. We constantly see through all the phenomena and case studies that we analyze in our team in Madrid that Iberia is a laboratory for the study of the construction, destruction, and blurring of religious, cultural, and political boundaries, which is what, as Ian has said, been for a long time the subject, the main field of my research. We have Arabic Qurans copied by Muslims throughout the Morisco period up to the beginning of the 17th century. Some of them are rich and well-decorated manuscripts that reveal the patronage of wealthy Muslim families and the existence of copyists, calligraphers, and illustrators, access to good paper, to good ink. A very good example is this mushaf preserved in the Real Academia de la Historia, copied in 1597 at the end of the century by Muhammad Ballester in a village called Aranda del Moncayo. There is a relatively small number of them. Inquisition trials demonstrate that they existed in high numbers, but were systematically confiscated and burned by the Inquisition, or later hidden and taken by the Moriscos in their exile. When they were expelled, as I told you, in 1609, 1614. Most of the copies of the Mudéjar and Morisco Qurans that have reached us date from the 16th century and constitute either a part or an excerpt of the Quran of what is known in scholarly literature as Abridged Qurans. These Abridged Qurans, here with an Aljamiado commentary, exist both in Arabic and in Aljamiado. Translating the Quran for Muslims was not an evident option, as you know. Gerard Wiegers, my colleague and collaborator, has studied the responses of the office of 4 chief Qadis of Mamluk Cairo, representing the 4 Sunni madhahib, issued at the request of Mudéjars from Aragon a decade before the forced conversion of the Aragonese Muslims. One of the questions the Mudéjars addressed to the Qadis was whether or not it was legitimate to translate the Quran or not into non-Arabic languages. The responses vary according to the different approaches of the 4 schools, but they are all in accord about the legitimacy of vernacular tafsirs, that is to say, the translation in the sense of commentary. That is approved. The fatwas seem to aim at limiting the ritual and visible use of Romance vernaculars and literal translation, but they take a non-rejective view of the possibility of Islam living in a minority position with the limitation of such a position entails. So that what we have in Morisco translations of the Quran, I show you just one example of a same surah. You see how it varies according to the extent or the different sources of tafsir they are using. This is very important for understanding the features of the translations made by Mudéjars and Moriscos. And also the high diffusion of this abridged Quran. In fact, it is remarkable that there is only one complete Quran translated during this period that has reached us, what is known as the Toledo Quran copied it 1606 in Castilian language, and as the copyist said, made in Latin script from an aljamiado exemplar. We have other complete copies, but all of them made after the expulsion outside the peninsula in the Morisco diaspora. One is the one in Thessaloniki, in Salonika, where there was an important community of Iberian exiles, both Morisco and Sephardic Jews. This Quran was translated by Ibrahim Izquierdo. It contains an interlinear translation in Arabic and Castilian, and is now at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The Abridged Qurans, we have about 50 examples. They consisted of a selection, always the same. So all the Abridged Qurans have the same surahs. They contain the chapters or the verses most usually recited in daily prayer, generally arranged by the length of the surahs, the longest first. The Abridged Quran show the agency that the Moriscos take with the Quranic text, because these Abridged Qurans provide prayers, especially funerary prayers, selected some of these surahs. It's my hypothesis, but there is work to be done there, selected to counteract the fact that Moriscos are living in a Christian society, that they live their religion in clandestinity and are obliged to comply with Christian ritual, for example, in burials. And then the prayers that you can say after a burial and that you can say in private or in a small group become extremely important. So these Abridged Qurans are a stronghold of Muslim identity. We also have another type of Abridged Qurans, the ones who are organized in reverse order, the shortest surahs before and then the longest. And the remains we have were copied in places where we know they were schools of copyists and Quranic schools. It seems they were used to learn the Quran by heart. They are also very interesting. Again, the Inquisition trials show the importance of memory and orality for Moriscos, to the point that some of them, according to the Inquisition trials, even shunned the use of paper for memorizing instead of the wood tablet that can be washed and erased. So memory was the main place to treasure your Quran. Despite firm evidence of Roman translations of the Quran among Christians in the late 14th to 15th centuries, the earliest surviving translations of the Quran into Romance are therefore those circulating among Mudéjar and Morisco populations. But there is bridging the gap between the Christian use of the Quran and the Muslim, an important figure of a man named Juan Andrés, a converted faqih who worked at the service of a bishop, of which I'm going to speak, for preaching and converting Muslims at the end of the 15th century. And with Juan Andrés, I pass at the second part of the lecture of the Christian translations. Between 1502, when Isabel of Castile banned the Islamic religion, as I have told you, in his kingdom, and her grandson, Charles V, banned in 1526 in Aragon, various authors wrote polemical works and sermons aimed at the evangelization of the forcibly converted Muslim populations. there was a messianic idea that this conversion will become universal and will be the whole humanity will be united under a religion and under one single head, one single king. Just to point to you, from Fernando of Aragon to Charles V, all the kings bear the title of King of Jerusalem. They were going to conquer Jerusalem. It's a messianic, a provincialist political idea. The authors and patrons of all these people working in the first decades of the 16th century aimed at refuting the Quran, or in other words, at basing the refutation of Islam for preaching to the Muslim solely on the Quran. Their precedent can be considered the Spanish translation of the work by Ricoldo da Monte di Croce titled Refutation of the Quran, printed in Seville in 1502 under the auspices of Bishop of Granada, Hernando de Talavera. The Latin edition of this same book had also been printed in Seville 2 years earlier, financed by King Fernando of Aragon. These are the illustrations, a Dominican preaching to Muslims. But if you see the third one, which was also printed, but in Mexico, it has the same illustration, but it said, en lengua castellana y zapoteca, so that these mechanics or strategies or methodologies for converting Moriscos were contemporary or shortly after used in Mexico for the local populations. So it was Hernando de Talavera who patronized this work by Ricoldo da Monte da Croce, but it was another bishop, also confessor to Queen Isabel, Martín García, who patronized a series of books that we know as anti-Alcoranes. Most of the authors of the anti-Alcoranes were connected to this Martín García, canon of the Saragossan See from Saragossa in Aragon, Inquisitor, Grand Inquisitor of Aragon, later Bishop of Barcelona. He had been asked by the Catholic monarchs to come to Granada to begin missionizing and pastoral work there soon after the conquest of the city. And Garcia gathered a group of people who became engaged in campaigns for converting the Muslims and who wrote treatises, the ones we know as anti-Alcoranes, between 1515 and between 1555. This Juan Andrés, I mentioned, is the first one, Bernardo Pérez de Chinchón. Well, there is a whole group of them. In a limited span of time, a considerable number of works came into being. The writings of Martín García himself, particularly his sermons, and those of his group of collaborators were constructed according to the same principles, using the same device, the device of direct dialogue with will question Muslim. Próximo mío de Moro, mi querido Moro, something like my dear fellow, my dear good neighbor, how can you believe, and then quoting some story of the Quran, referring solely to address this Muslim solely on Muslim sources, the Quran, but also the tafsir, I will mention. In reality, of course, the underlying discourse was a Christian polemical one, deeply but not exclusively immersed in medieval tradition. This was the strategy also of Ricoldo da Monte di Croce, who had such a wide diffusion, as I've told you, in Christian translation. Direct access to the scriptures for this group of scholars, which were all of them much immersed in Erasmianism, is an important principle. Here you have Bernardo Pérez de Chinchón work, one of the main anti-Alcoranos book. This book by Bernardo Pérez de Chinchón was not only directed against Islam, but it was very much aimed at spreading Erasmian ideas at a time when in Spain those ideas were already controversial, including in particular his particular reading of the epistles of Paul and all that went with it. All the anti-Alcoranes contain numerous Quranic quotations which are recorded in Arabic transcribed into Latin alphabet, accompanied by the Spanish translation and the pertinent exegesis provided by the authors of tafsir. Writers of the anti-Alcoran genre cultivate a dual focus on language and doctrine that combines attention to the Arabic language with discussion of the Quranic content. It is worth considering the question of what role the ability to read Arabic, either silently or aloud, these transcriptions were supposed to aid preachers to read a text which will sound as Arabic, played in the missionary campaign of Garcia and his circle. Written transliteration plays a valuable role in highlighting the place of oral presentation of the Quran in campaigns of preaching to the Muslims and Moriscos from Granada to Valencia. Whereas earlier polemical writers sought authority in the presentation and translation of content from the Quran, authors of the anti-Alcoranes also used transliteration as a rhetorical tool to appeal to listeners through the sound of their Arabic sources. In so doing, they were counting on the oral modality of the Muslim engagement with the text. We can also consider the question of transliteration. We've been speaking of Romans in Arabic letters by Muslims, Arabic in Latin letters by Christians. Some scholars, most notably Ryan Spitz, calls this second form of transliteration as inverse aljamiado, anti-aljamiado, because he considers that in this context, changing alphabets is not neutral, but rather a tool of identity formation or of undermining identity formation. It has to be considered if one community transliterate in order to express and defend identity, while the other employs transliteration to undermine that identity formation. It's an interesting idea. I'm not sure that I agree with it, but it is worth considering. But the first and most important work in the series of what have come to be known as anti-Alcoranes is Confusión o Confutación de la secta mahomética y del Alcorán, published in 1515 in Valencia by this Juan Andrés, allegedly a faqih from Játiva in Valencia who had converted to Christianity voluntarily. Juan Andrés, in the preface to his Confusión, claims to have converted to Catholicism in 1487 and to have preached to his former co-religionists in both Valencia and Granada, where he was a canon of the cathedral. He further states in the preface that in about 1510, he translated the whole Quran and the Sunnah at the behest and under the patronage of Martín García. Juan Andrés was familiar with exegetical works, quoting freely from those of Al-Samakhshari and Ibn Atiyya, and quoting Ibn Abi Samanin, who was known to the Moriscos and exists in Aljamia. Juan Andrés did not rely on existing material in translation, such as previous translations in Latin or Romance, in order to create his own versions. He includes more than 100 citations of Arabic taken directly also from Hadith, passages that are not available in any known previous translation. In all his citations, the importance of oral pronunciation as the foundation of his transliterations of Arabic underscores the primary role of the anti-Alcoranes as an aid to preachers, not an intellectual manual for formal written polemics. The their clear role of orality, the transliteration of Arabic on the basis of oral pronunciations, and the intended use of such transliterations for reading aloud in the context of preaching or oral dispute, again insists or underdashes the fundamental oral reality of Islam for the Moriscos. And how hearing the Quran was a key element in Muslim experience and practice. Juan Andrés was a pioneer in the writing of anti-Muslim polemic, and his book marks a number of important firsts in the European encounter with Islam. But 6 years later, we have, just before the Aragonese Decree of Conversion, another very important work, that of Joan Martí de Figuerola, also from Valencia, Lumbre de Fe, also under the aegis of Martín García. This, we have a manuscript. It has never yet been published. And he also includes hundreds of Quranic passages and is heavily illustrated. I put here an illustration for a surah on the Virgin Mary, but to show you just how the authors of Anti-Alcoranes were using tafsir and knew the importance of tafsir. Here you have Muhammad and Benatia and Samakhshari. So it is as if the three of them together were dictating the text of the Quran. And as it has not been printed, and there was such a problem, as Roberto told us this morning, with mobile types, here is the aspect the manuscript of Martín García has. It has Arabic, it has Arabic in Latin letters, it has the Castilian translation, and it has what the glosadores say, what the authors of tafsir said. Martí de Figuerola does not use Juan Andrés' translation, but prefers to rely on sources from Islamic tradition provided to him by Juan Gabriel, a recently converted al-Faqih from Teruel, who translated parts of the Quran for him and accompanied him in his campaigns. Martí de Figuerola describes in detail how he worked together with Juan Gabriel and how they had recourse to Hadith and the Sirah of Muhammad. He was also very engaged in trying to make the authorities of Aragon to convert his Muslims. He is writing in 1518, 1520. And to this end, he went to Zaragoza, as he didn't have any echo in Aragon, and the papal legate was arriving in Zaragoza. He went there to meet with him and to Adrian of Utrecht, the previous legate who was going to be Pope Adrian VI. This papal legate, Roberto has spoken of him this morning, was Egidio da Viterbo, who wrote his own Latin translation, a Latin translation that is now lost, but we have a copy of the original in the library of El Escorial, made in 1621 by the Scottish Orientalist David Colville, who for many years worked in that library. In a 3-page preface to this copy, Colville provides information about the context of the translation and about the people intellectually involved in its preparation. Colville mentions 3 individuals: the Cardinal Egidio da Viterbo himself, Juan Gabriel of Teruel, Ioannes Gabrielis Terrolensis, and Al-Hassan al-Wasan, known in Europe as Leo Africanus, famous by his De la Descrizione dell'Africa, Leo Africanus, who had been captured at sea in the same year, 1518, and converted to Christianity under the patronage of Egidio da Viterbo. The sequence of the work on the text, as explained by Colville, was that Egidio da Viterbo first commissioned this Morisco, Juan Gabriel, to translate the Quran, but the translation was later corrected by Leo Africanus. Colville, when copying the translation, maintains all the versions and the corrections. So the Colville manuscript contains a translation from Arabic into Latin, which had been commissioned by an Italian cardinal from a scholar of Spanish Muslim origin, and the text had been edited and reworked by another convert from Islam to Christianity, also from Christian Iberian origin, who lived in Italy. But also connected to this Egidio is the important Quran of Belus, the surname Quran of Belus, Belus being a village near Valencia, where it was copied again in the same year, 1518, precisely the year that Egidio was in Spain. The manuscript has interlinear translation and glosses in Latin, Castilian, and Catalan, demonstrating that the Belus Quran came into the hands of Christian scholars who wanted to use it as a tool for studying Islam's sacred book. The Belus Quran is another important testimony we have about the process of collective and individual study of the text of the Quran, because it preserves traces of all the phases and figures involved in this process, from the initial work of the Muslim scribe who produced a careful professional copy, to the insertion of explanatory glosses in the margins and the marking up of parts of the text that were considered of interest and that would later be used in sermons and in different kinds of works written with the goal of converting Muslims. This copy of the Quran, during its circulation outside of Spain, appears in Egidio da Viterbo intellectual circle. All evidence points to the ownership by Orientalist Johann Albrecht von Winmanstetter, dead in 1557, of Heidelberg, who would have acquired it from the library of Egidio da Viterbo following the latter's death. Therefore, we can infer that this copy was used in the preparatory work for the translation commissioned by Cardinal Egidio. And we can see through the example of Egidio how interest of Moriscan knowledge arose in Italy, not only because of the collaboration of an Aragonese Morisco in the ambitious intellectual endeavors of an Italian cardinal, but also because Martí de Figueroa's work was brought to Italy and copied there, together with a number of Aljamiado and Morisco Arabic manuscripts by another papal legate, Cardinal Camillo Massimo. The stories of Egidio and many others before him, from Robert Eketon to Juan de Segovia, prove that in order to understand the Quran at a time when dictionaries and grammars were lacking, it was necessary to have the collaboration of a Muslim or a convert. And those were generally what in Spanish is called alfaquíes, from fakir, the persons who had an education in Quranic and religious sources. The collaboration of Muslim al-Faqihs, converted or not, was fundamental for the enterprise of the anti-Alcoranes. Juan Andrés was a convert himself. Bernardo Pérez de Chinchón worked, as he himself says, with al-Faqihs of Valencia, like the Cadi of Valencia himself. Martí de Figueroa had the converted al-Faqih of Teruel. At the same time, the authors of the anti-Alcoranes were, with their strategy of exhibiting the text and orality of the Quran to reinforce their authority, were probably targeting the al-Faqihs. It is through them that they thought they were going to implement conversion. All evidence indicates that the authors of the anti-Alcoranes considered al-Faqihs as a group to be the best intermediaries through which to convert their whole communities, the ones most susceptible to following and understanding their theological message. And this is not to say that I want to use the concept of reception in the sense that it may suggest some sort of homogeneous intellectual entities in the engagement with Islam. In fact, the different types of Quran translations made in 16th century Spain show how different registers of discourse could be employed for different audiences. As I said, the authors of the Anti-Quranes do not use all of them the same translation of the Quran, and they use the Quranic material in a very different manner. They were probably basing their work in different works of tafsir. It is more productive, I suggest, to think in terms of clusters of people or networks within which individual texts circulated and particular contexts in which these texts were then assigned meaning. Coming back to what I said at the beginning of this talk about using the Quranic translation as indicative of changes in the interior of Spanish Catholicism, something that it's at the moment what I am more interested in, we can perceive that around the 1530s, the whole perception in Catholic Spain of the evangelization of Muslims varied dramatically. In that decade, there was a strong shift in the means of achieving conversion. After the demise of the Erasmian Grand Inquisitor Manrique in 1533 and the work of the Council of Trent that started in the early 40s, a significant ideological change took place in Iberian Christendom. Now, it was considered dangerous to be using and publishing so much information about Islam that the Moriscos could easily access and then learn about their own religion and the Holy Book, to the point that it was even forbidden that the autos de fe, the crimes that the culprit was accused of were defined, so that other Moriscos or other people who were there were hearing about what were the ritual or the beliefs of Islam. And the Arabic language was now totally identified with Islam. Something that affected scholars and bibliophiles. It seemed that conversion was not possible through the means of persuasion considered by Hernando de Talavera or Martín García or his fellow followers a few decades before. But what was definitely barred at this time was direct access of believers to their sacred texts, including the Bible, whose Spanish or Catalan translations were forbidden and destroyed. The Romance Bible was put in the Index of Forbidden Books in 1551, first tentatively, and again and definitely in 1559. Protestantism and its threat looms large over the way in which Catholic Spain will deal from then on with Islam and with Judaism and with converts from both religions. With the Inquisition's harsher attitude towards converted Muslims came a pessimistic feeling regarding what was felt as a failure in their conversion. Involvement with the Quran, whether by Muslim or Christian, was dangerous, and the Anti-Quranes contain so much Quranic material that they could be, and in fact were, used by Muslims who had little access to the Quran or difficulty in understanding Arabic. Here you see Ignacio de las Casas, who was a converted Muslim, who says that they bought the Anti-Quranes not to get themselves evangelized or convinced, but because they have so many Quranic quotations that it is very useful for them. And therefore, the Anti-Quranes were banned, were forbidden, and were put in the list, the Catholic Index of Forbidden Books, precisely in 1559, the same year in which the Bible in Romance language was forbidden. The possession of Arabic Qurans became dangerous for Christian bibliophiles and collectors as well, and many had problems with the Inquisition. But this position, which came to predominate and had important consequences, was not homogeneous, is very varied and full of contradiction. For example, Philip II, the king who had forbidden the Arabic language, was at the same time forming an impressive collection of Arabic manuscripts in his royal library at El Escorial, which even today is one of the most important repositories of Arabic works in Europe. An ambiguous attitude towards Arabic books appears in many individual stories. Let me tell you, to finish just one. The Flemish humanist and Erasmianist Nicolaus Cleinaerts, or Nicolas de Clenard in French, came to Spain with Hernando Colón, the son of Colón, a most important bibliophile, with the idea of bettering his Arabic. He had started in Louvain a trilingual translations of the Psalms. Here you have Nicholas and his letters, of which I am going to quote. Well, in these letters to his colleagues back in Louvain, he affirms that in 1530, the famous Spanish theologian Francisco de Vitoria, professor in Salamanca, had asked him to translate the Quran into Latin as the sole means of converting the Moriscos. But Cleinaerts, who went after Salamanca to Seville and Granada, even with the help of the governor of this city, Luis de Mendoza, and of the Bishop of Burgos, was not able to obtain from the Inquisition the Arabic books that the bishops knew the Holy Office had confiscated in Granada. But instead, Luis de Mendoza found for Cleinaerts a Tunisian slave, a cultivated man who had been captivated at the time of the conquest of Tunis by Charles V. Cleinaerts started bettering his classical Arabic with him and started to work with him. He wanted to translate the Quran and went to Fez in Morocco in search of Arabic manuscript. But in Fez, his Tunisian Arabic teacher, now a freed slave, called Harouf at-Tunisi, was confronted with a fatwa issued by the scholar from Fez, Al-Yazistani. The gist of the fatwa was that it was not allowed to teach this Christian student the Quran. The Mufti based himself on the dominant point of view in the Malikite school of law that it is forbidden to teach unbelievers the Quran and Arabic script, for they may tarnish it. So the difficulty of accessing Qurans, copies of the Quran, and Quran translations enhanced still more the usefulness of the anti-Alcoranes. We have said that Morisco bought them as used them as an aid to reading the Quran. And also did the scholars. In 1510, this same Hernando de Colón, the son of Christopher Columbus, who had collected an immense library, bought a beautiful and richly decorated Quran that he describes in his catalog. And in the same catalog, in the same entry, he includes Ricoldo da Monte di Croce, Refutación del Alcorán, which Colón, who knew little Arabic, probably used to guide himself through his copy. And we also know that even Philip II bought a copy of an anti-Alcorán in Valencia in 1541. Even after the anti-Alcoranes were banned and included in the index of forbidden books, the material organized and employed in the anti-Alcoranes provided a basis for subsequent discussions of and attacks on Islam outside the peninsula, in the rest of Europe. Arguments similar to those of the authors of the Anti-Alcoranes can be found repeated in later writers till very late, until most remarkable by Ludovico Marracci in the 17th century, of which Roberto was speaking this morning. Juan Andrés was a pioneer in the writing of anti-Muslim polemic and had, as I say, hundreds of Quranic quotations. His book was extremely influential in both Spain and in Europe. It was printed in Spain in 1515, 19, 37, 60. The first translation into Italian appeared in Venice in 1537. Another 5 editions followed in Italian, also in Venice, up to 1597. There was 1 translation to French and 2 in German, printed in 1598 and 1685, and 3 editions of the Latin translation, 1 in English and 1 into Dutch. And with this, I finish. As I say, I think that, among other things, the different trajectories of the idea and the practice of translating the Quran is extremely meaningful of the different options that Catholicism was taking in this 16th century towards the use and the direct access to sacred scriptures. And this is an angle which makes all this translation still more interesting for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mercedes. A great closing of a wonderful first day. I don't know, do I need to use the microphone, or can I just use one of those? And I think Mercedes is also happy to answer a few questions if there are questions or comments from the audience. I would also like to encourage, I see there are quite a few students as well, so you're all welcome to just ask any question. You might not have understood everything, but please feel free to ask Mercedes or the others. I was wondering why Philip II would have collected such a large collections of Arabic manuscripts. Why was he kind of banking on them getting more valuable? Why they were becoming more rare?
It is a complex issue. We, as you said in this book, you mentioned the Orient in Spain. We started to deal with it. No. Arabic books are dangerous, but they are also prestigious. People know that there is a lot of knowledge inside these books that is worth preserving, especially medicine, astrology, and so forth. At this 16th century, it is also being written for the first time a sort of official historiography, a sort of proto-national historiography is being written. And there is this sense or the feeling and sometimes the discussion that in Arabic books you get knowledge that is interesting for knowing the history of Spain. But I also think that it symbolizes power over the other. If you collect a big, precious collection of books. It was also a time in which, as you know, it was beginning to be in diplomatic circles, in noble families, a prestigious gift to give to each other, a beautiful illuminated Arabic manuscripts. So having them was, and there were several noblemen like Hurtado de Mendoza who had wonderful collections. They all wanted to legate it to the El Escorial or to the cathedral of the city they belonged to. But then the Inquisition intervened. And before going to a public, let's say, institution, the Inquisition had to go through them and see if they were, you know, the ones on mathematics or on medicine and so forth were perfectly legitimate. But Qurans were always dangerous. And also the Inquisition took a long time because it didn't have so many experts. It had quite a few. So there were books were rotting away in some, that's the ones that Clenardus wanted, no? Give me a few of the ones you have in this basement or whatever, no? But the Inquisition was very, very protective and very careful in this sense. It happened the same with the Bibles. But it seems to be very contradictory.
It is very
contradictory.
Absolutely.
And it happens in all the sense. This Cisneros cardinal, which is supposed to have burnt in Granada Qurans, he took an enormous amount of Arabic manuscript to his newly founded university in Alcalá de Henares, and at the same time he was patronizing a trilingual edition and translation of the Bible. So I think it's very important we take into the account all this Erasmian effort to have access to the sources and to, let's say, clean and depurate Catholicism from so many things, and then Protestantism arrives and everything is
and we have many occasions, particularly also in Protestant Europe, of like Qurans being gifted between kind of, between Protestant rulers, and the Quran it has a lot of symbolic value, obviously, as well.
It has a lot of symbolic.
So anyway, but Justin, you had a question, please, and then.
It's on?
Anyway. It is.
Okay.
I think. Yeah.
So thank you so much. This was a wonderful overview, both a dual story, shall we say, of the Quran, both within the Morisco context and then also on the other side. And I was wondering a little bit if you could tie another part of a story that you've worked so much on, that is to say, of the lead tablets of Sacromonte, into this story of what it means for the Arabic to be slowly less accessible to Muslims who are living in the Iberian Peninsula as the 16th century proceeds, and what happens then when they lose that access as the Catholic and the Inquisition decides that the Arabic text itself is dangerous and has to be held back. Is there a longer story that we can tell between then and the second half of the 16th century before the expulsion of the Moriscos at the beginning of the 17th?
I don't know if I understood your question properly. The fact that they are losing the Arabic is a source of anxiety for Moriscos. That is for sure. And they do enormous efforts to learn some Arabic or some prayers in Arabic, even when they do not know very well. I know them also because of the Inquisition trials, in which the secretary makes them recite and writes it down, no? By the sound. No? They wanted to preserve a little bit, and they were looking, some of them, well, it was forbidden that that Moriscos bought slaves, because it was said that they had a tendency to bought slaves captured for North Africa, so to have someone who will taught them Arabic. So this is a source of anxiety, and it goes in different levels. The level you mention is the lead books of the Sacromonte, which is a fraud, a Morisco fraud, which is supposed to be an apocryphal or an evangile, a false fifth evangile, dictated by Virgin Mary in Arabic to some Muslim disciples who came to Spain at the beginning of Islam. But what they were trying to do with that, and they do it in different places and in different ways, is to separate Arabic from Islam, to defend that Arabic doesn't mean Islam, that there are Christians in the East, in Egypt, that speak Arabic, that the Virgin Mary dictated in Arabic a text to his disciples, that all kind of efforts to try to make Arabic as one of the other local languages in Spain, you know? Catalans speak Catalan, Granadans speak Arabic, Castilians speak Castilian. It doesn't mean that they follow a different religion. They do a lot of efforts for that, but they are not at all successful. And there is another trend in this Quran of Toledo, which I show you a picture, in which Morisco said that in order to copy the Quran that he had borrowed, to go very quickly, he copies it in Latin script, in Aljamiya Latin script, while the copy was in Aljamiado says, as long as we understand our law, no? As long as we have the text, this is the important part. No? I apologize for not using even the sacred alphabet, but the important thing is that we have it. That is what confers our Muslim identity. So there is a wide range of reactions to losing the language, and diverse strategies that they try to maintain it to no avail. Well, they were expelled anyway, so who knows what would have happened, but they were expelled, deported, all of them.
Hello, I'm Annika Lenson. I missed the morning sessions, so have only attended the keynote. And my question had to do with the slide of the three images side by side, the same image, and in two instances when printed, it was to represent an anti-Quranic.
The Ricardo da Montecroce.
And the third was the New Spain or Mexican use of the same plate.
Yeah, yeah.
And
en lengua zapoteca, yeah. But I cannot move it now. Something happens here. Yes,
I'll pose
go
the
with
question
your
while we waited.
I wanted to go back to
Well, the question, as we wait for this to come up,
Yes.
is maybe two parts. You invited us to think about orality, and we have all of these instances of recuperating the sound of language through writing on the page. So I'm curious how you interpret what we are seeing here. Is the refutation of the Quran also an oral performance? Are we seeing voice getting distributed to these crowds? And the second question is, how do you reconcile print and orality at this moment with the physical travel of the same plate to New Spain? So I'm curious about print culture and orality as we can see it in this fascinating transfer.
Well, yeah, here it is, no? Printing for the use of preachers, but the preachers, for example, Martí de Firola, always affirms that when he goes to preach the Muslim, he carries his own Quran. So the physicality of the Quran is important. But the orality, the sound, the hearing, the memorizing, they know enough about Islam to know it's fundamental. The Inquisition also knows. For example, when he interrogates what person who they fear are al-Faqirs, they always ask if he has been reciting or reading the Quran publicly to other people, no? That if he has read it aloud, no? Not only that he has it and he read it, but if he has been reading it aloud, they know this is a pillar, or they consider it's a pillar of the local Islam they are dealing with. In New Spain, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know enough. I've been trying to look into it lately because I found so many points of contact between what happens in what was then New Spain, the Mexican kingdom, and Granada, even with similar protagonists, no? The Mendozas and so forth. No? But I do not know enough of the local religions or culture to say what it means. What it means to me, this similar illustration, is that they go there with the same frame of mind and methodological approach to the religion of the other, which for them is Islam.
If I can just quickly, but this anti-alhamiado that you showed us, which is so interesting, but that is really an indication that the refutation was also oral, right? I mean, because that wouldn't make much sense in a printed, I mean, it is in a printed text as well, but it's a clear indicator that there is an...
and we have, from that we have Nahuatl text transcribed into the Latin alphabet. So they are using very much the oral. What I do not know if it was as prestigious or as important. No?
Methodist, thank you very much. I have a very, very general question, and as always, I think of the Central European contemporaries, and with an analogy. As Jans pointed out this morning, obviously, and I'm sure you'd agree, obviously the engagement with the Quran in Europe is, of course, is not always polemical, but and it goes much further. But of course, we have an important case where it's inimical, where it's an enemy, where it's conceived as a danger. But there's, for me at least, so I'm working mostly on Central Europe. There's, I think, a decisive difference, and I'd like to see if you agree with my suggestion. Someone like Martin Luther, who's of course who championed the publication of Quran translation, but is in no way kindlier or more sympathetic to Islam or the Quran. It's a polemical undertaking. But I think the fundamental point is for someone like Luther, and he's typical, he's not unusual, is that Quran and Islam, and of course he never meets Muslims. They're almost despite the political wars between the empire and the Ottoman Empire and his own empire, I think for him a fairly abstract and almost a theological abstract. The Quran, more specifically, is an adversary. It's an external, dangerous adversary. In the Iberian Peninsula, I'm guessing, and I'd like to hear your opinion, the Quran is a contamination. It's a form of maybe because of it's actually not external, and that's perhaps ironically what dooms for the short term, for 2 centuries, what dooms perhaps Arabic and the rich Muslim culture in the Iberian Peninsula, ironically, is perhaps this very intimate closeness, where it's not an external foe, but a contamination.
Yeah, you are right. In Spain, Islam is not external. I'm calling it Spain, although it is not Spain. It's the Iberian Peninsula. Spain didn't exist yet. No? And as I say, the problem of rejection and marking borders is because very often and in many aspects, religious authorities in Spain have the conviction that Spanish Catholicism is being contaminated by Islam and by Judaism. But then I have spoken of the quotations of the anti-Alcoranes, but not so much of which quotations they choose. And for example, they choose always quotations about the Virgin Mary and quotations about Jesus. So they choose a lot quotations of parts of the Quran who are near enough Catholicism to attract proselytes. But at the same time, these similarities engender fear. Fear that this is too close. It is close, but it is not what we believe. So there is there a tension which I find extremely interesting of what is in fact a deep entanglement, because we are speaking about books and about texts, but these texts were being read to people who lived in villages where they were going to the processions of the Corpus Christi, and they took the Virgin out when there was a drought to bring water, and the Moors, as they say, would also go. No? So there is a social and cultural interaction which also forms part of the context in which these people who is working with the text of the Quran is living, and they know that borders are dangerous. In this book of the Iberian Quran, I was telling you, Charles Burnett, who has the first chapter, speaks of the first translation, in particular of Mark of Toledo, as being directed to the Mozarabs, to the Christians who had been living in Muslim territories, because they fear they are contaminated by Islam. Not only that they are Arabic speakers, but they have been living too long among Muslims. It is necessary also to teach Christians what being Christian means when you are living with different kind of people, who does sacred things that might be tempting or interesting or fun because it's a feast and you want to participate in. So this is a context which is very different to what happens in other parts of Europe.
Although I think that we have similarities in Eastern Europe as well. I mean, when in the Ottoman borderlands, we have exactly the same.
Probably.
In Poland, Czech.
I'm sure.
We have texts that really try to. There is a fear that people find Islam attractive, and so there's a kind of a form of bringing these people in line and telling them, and also always mentioning the similarities between. So there's some similarities, obviously, between the Quran and the Bible, and so don't you think that becoming a Muslim could be kind of a good alternative to being a Christian? So we have this similar, I think, in these borderlands as well, similar developments.
In the 16th century in Iberia, this goes with a very strong pastoral campaigns because of Trento and because the authorities have the conviction that people do not know very well what being Catholic means, no? Somebody was saying this morning that they are inventing the idea of religion at this time in Europe. And I was thinking that in the Iberian case is very clear. And they have to teach people who sometimes do things for the rain or for whatever, or find attractive how clean the mosques are, though in the Martí de Figuerola says, we leave dogs enter our churches and our women go to the church, you know, to show off and so forth, while they have this very clean, there is the envy also of some of the sacred things that the others do. And the feeling that this exists all the time produces reactions to separate and eliminate clearly what belongs to one side and to the other.
Thank you very much. Great. There are no more questions. I think that was a great finish for this great day, for your great lecture. Thank you so much. Please join me again in thanking
Thank you
Mercedes.
very much.
And thank you, everybody, for coming. We will continue with the scholarly event tomorrow at 10. I think we can also there's breakfast from 9 to 10 outside. And those who want to join us, we are going to have dinner, and it would be lovely to have as many of you as possible with us. Thank you very much for coming.